Welcome to tonight's Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm Cleo from Winchester Skeptics, and I'll be your host for the evening. As I'm sure most of you know by now, we're a collaboration of Skeptics in the Pubs group from around the country, and we got together because of lockdown to move our talks online. We're very proud to have a fantastically wide range of topics, but all our speakers approach their subjects from a rational, evidence-based points of view. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, who will be talking to us about denial and denialism. Are we nearing the end of denialism? And could what's next be even worse? His talk will last something between 45 and 60 minutes. Then we'll have a 15-minute break, followed by a Q&A. If you want to ask a question, go to the link below where you can raise one. The other link at the bottom of the screen will take you to where you can donate to help with our running costs. Our mods will post other links in the chat from time to time, such as how to buy our stylish skeptical apparel and where to find out more about our speaker and how to buy his books. So, Dr. Kahn-Harris is a sociologist and author. He's written numerous books, including Strange Hate, Anti-Semitism, Racism and the Limits of Diversity, and Denial, the Unspeakable Truth. His next book, which will be published later this year, is called The Babel Message. It's a book about language based on multilingual translations of the Kinder Surprise warning message. Yes, really. So he's a lecturer at Leo Birkbeck College, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a director at the European Jewish Research Archive. He's contributed to various publications, including The Guardian and The New Statesman. But I've saved my favourite tidbit of information till last. One of Keith's books is based on his PhD thesis. It's called Extreme Metal, Music and Culture on the Edge. Researching something you love has to be the way to go. So it's time now to give Dr. Kahn-Harris a very warm SitP-O welcome for his talk, The End of Denialism. Over to you.
Thanks very much to Cleo. I have to say I've missed doing talks at Skeptics in the Pub. This latest book of mine, my penultimate book, the cover of which I'll show you in just a second, came out in 2018. And in the years following that, the pleasure of doing about my ideas about denial and denialism at a number of Skeptics in the Pub. So I was really happy to get the invitation to talk about these things online. And in doing so, of course, I realized that my talk had to be updated because since my book was published in 2018, something quite big has happened. And that something, of course, was COVID. And one of the things I've tried to do in the talk that will follow is try and see what COVID denialism and what I call post-denialism actually means and what it tells us. So I'm not going to do a lot of plugs for the book available online from the usual places. So this is my book, Denial, the Unspeakable Truth. It should really be called Denialism because that's really what the book is mostly about. The problem is that denialism doesn't really have the brand identity. It's an ugly word. So the book is called Denial. I'm going to explain what I mean by denialism, though. Denialism is things such as denial that anthropogenic global warming is happening, denial that the Holocaust happened, the view that vaccines are dangerous or do not work, the view that AIDS is not caused by HIV, that AIDS doesn't exist, or that HIV doesn't exist, and views such as creationism that argue that evolution can be disproved. So these are forms of denialism. So what is COVID denialism and how might it differ from COVID denial? I'm going to start with a definition by Stanley Cohen of denial. Stanley Cohen was a sociologist who died a few years ago, originally South African sociologist who moved to Britain. You might know him from the concept of moral panic, which he did a lot to popularize from his book Folk Devils and Moral Panic, which came out in the 1960s. He defines in his book States of Denial, he defines denial as follows: a statement about the world or the self, or about your knowledge of the world or yourself, which is neither literally true nor a lie intended to deceive others, but allows for the strange possibility of simultaneously knowing and not knowing, The existence of what is denied must be somehow known, and statements expressing this denial must be somehow believed. Strangeness is the word. The idea that human beings are capable of knowing something and not knowing it at the same time does seem counterintuitive. But I think we all can probably identify with this at some level. We all have our elephants in the room, the things that we know to be true about ourselves, often in our personal lives, but don't quite want to acknowledge. So here's an example of denial about the Holocaust, as opposed to Holocaust denial as it's usually understood. This is a book that came out a few years ago by Jan Gross called Neighbours. It came out in Poland a few years ago, and it was about a massacre that occurred during the Second World War in Poland in a place called Jedwabne in 1941, in which the townspeople massacred the Jews. And a massacre of Jews, of course, was quite a common thing to happen in Poland in the Second World War. But the difference here was this was not provoked by the Nazis. The villagers, the townspeople, did this off their own bat. Now, the facts of this were known for many, many years after the war. It was never an unknown episode in history, but it was an episode that was not talked about. And when Gross published this book, there was a firestorm of outrage from some quarters at his temerity to raise something that was a painful and difficult and dangerous chapter in their history. So that's an example of denial. It's not saying that something didn't happen, it's silence. It's about not wanting to talk about something. And you find denial of this kind in the case of climate change as well. This is a book that came out, I think, about 15 years ago by Carrie Norgard called Living in Denial. And she was a sociologist who spent a couple of years in a small Norwegian town that made its living in part through winter sports. And she talks a lot about how winter and snow are an essential part of Norwegian identity. But the year she was there, the snow didn't come until the end of January, and even then it wasn't very deep. Now, the villagers there, they didn't deny that this was happening due to climate change, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't make that link. It was not denialism in the sense of saying nothing happened, nothing is happening. It was about talking about anything else other than the elephant into the room, that climate change was making warmer winters more and more common. So what's an example of denial of this kind about COVID? Well, one example took place almost a year ago. It was about a week before the lockdown, and it was the Cheltenham, I forget what it's actually called, the Cheltenham Racing Festival, which went ahead as scheduled, even though at the time many people were saying this was an incredibly bad idea. It was a place with absolutely no distancing, where a lot of people were drinking heavily, where people were packed into small spaces for long periods of time. And there was a recent article about this in The Guardian, a Guardian long read, that talks about the consequences of this, and also about the fact that the people who attended knew what was happening or was about to happen, but yet did not want to talk about it. This is COVID denial. It is not saying that COVID isn't a thing or it's dangerous. It's about living in the face of it and not adapting your behavior and pretending it is not there. How does denialism differ then? Well, here's a definition of denialism that I find helpful by Mark and Chris Hoofnagel, who I don't think it's updated anymore, used to run a quite important blog called denialism.com. And they argue that denialism is the employment of rhetorical tactics to give the appearance of argument or legitimate debate when in actuality there is none. These false arguments are used when one has few or no facts to support one's viewpoint against a scientific consensus or against overwhelming evidence to the contrary. They are effective in distracting from actual useful debate using emotionally appealing but ultimately empty and illogical assertions. So this isn't silence. This is talk. This is rhetoric. This is argument. And an example of Holocaust denialism, the sort of thing that actually confusingly most people call Holocaust denial, can be found in organizations such as this. This is the Institute for Historical Review, which looks like a very respectable scholarly institute, which has been one of the main centers for arguments arguing that the Holocaust did not happen. And here's an example of denialism regarding climate change. This is the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which you might know of. Nigel Lawson was one of the founders of it, which is in Britain one of the centres of argumentation that anthropogenic climate change is not happening. In both cases, there is a strong attempt to create something that looks scholarly, respectable, scientific. These are organizations that are not silent. They're not trying to prevent people talking about these things. They are trying to substitute their argument for the consensus argument. So what's an example of COVID denialism? Well, I'm going to distinguish two particular types. The first is what I would call COVID denialism. Is what I would call strong COVID denialism. And this is a collection, it's a fairly disparate collection of arguments that say, for example, as in this particular flyer here, that masks can't stop viruses, that COVID doesn't exist. Some people would argue that viruses themselves do not exist. This is trying to sweep away entirely the idea that there is a pandemic, that there is anything going on whatsoever. And it is often tied to conspiracies about the hidden agenda of those who have promoted COVID as a hoax. And you can find one of the people, the strongest proponents of this and best known is Piers Corbyn, who's Jeremy Corbyn's brother. He's organised a number of demonstrations and is now apparently standing for Mayor of London. This kind of denialism is still, I would argue, in this country at least, still relatively marginal, although in parts of America it has a much stronger presence. But what is much more common is what I would call either weak COVID denialism or proto-COVID denialism or wannabe COVID denialism. And I'll explain what I mean by those latter terms in just a second. And one example of this is Toby Young, the commentator. And his it's not really an organisation, it's an online project he runs called Lockdown Skeptics. Now, neither Toby Young nor people on Lockdown Skeptics argue that COVID doesn't exist or that viruses don't exist or anything else. What they have tried to do, though, is create outwardly convincing arguments that lockdowns don't work, sometimes that masks are ineffective, and sometimes that the entire strategy is wrong. The reason I call it proto-COVID denialism is I think this kind of soft COVID denialism or weak COVID denialism often leads to the harder forms. You might even call it wannabe COVID denialism because, and this isn't a particularly scholarly reflection from me, I sometimes get the sense from some of the people around Toby Young that they would really quite like to be Piers Corbyn, but don't quite have the guts to go there. As I say, that's not a very scholarly conclusion on my part. That's mere speculation. Nonetheless, that's what I think. So to sum up, what's the difference between denial, as I understand it, and denialism? First of all, denial creates silence or absence, whereas denialism creates noise and presence. Denial avoids truth and is vulnerable to truth, whereas denialism recreates its own truth and actively resists truth. Denial is produced individually in thousands of individual silences, although in some cases it may be publicly enforced. Denialism is a matter of institutions and publicity. Denial's relationship to scholarship is ignorance, sometimes deliberate or willful ignorance, whereas denialism creates an imitation or a pastiche of scholarship. The alternative to denial is what I call acknowledgement. If denial breaks down under the onslaught of truth, the only thing you can do is to acknowledge its existence. I expect that most of the people who were at the Cheltenham Racing Festival subsequently acknowledged the situation and what they actually did. Whereas denialism's alternative is what I call affirmation or celebration. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, and it's quite dark. The alternative to Holocaust denialism is affirming or celebrating the Holocaust. The alternative to at least the stronger forms of COVID denialism is a kind of celebration too. Denial is usually opposed by education, by people who seek to break the silence. Denialism is usually opposed by people who seek to debunk the arguments. And here we come to a problem. The problem is that denialism is extremely difficult to debunk, and debunking often doesn't work. Now, there's several whole lectures that I can give about how denialism actually works. I've just singled out three broad techniques that denialists use. But the first thing to say is that, in my view, a good denialist argument is any denialist argument. The point about denialism is to create presence, to create the impression that there is something there, that there is a substantial body of work. So really, in this respect, denialists can't lose. They want to create something, and they do repeatedly. In doing so, they draw on a variety of techniques. The first one I call is radical doubt. That is seeking to cast doubt on even the tiniest and most consensus kinds of truths, and that's related to the second technique, which I call obsession with detail. If you look, for example, at Twitter accounts or blogs by people who or anti-vaxxers, for example, during the COVID pandemic, you will find a blizzard of tiny details that, unless you are a expert across the board, are very, very difficult to refute. Denialists often have a laser kind of focus on particular details. If, for example, creationists, those who seek to deny evolution, often focus on the eye and what they call the irreducible complexity of the eye, which they argue the only conclusion that you can reach from that is that the eye has to have been created by a designer. It could not have simply evolved. Holocaust deniers focus on things such as the position of chimneys in Auschwitz. There's this blizzard of tiny details that is very, very difficult to deal with. But one thing that is also common to all denialist techniques is conspiratorial thinking, also known as the Galileo fallacy, which is the Galileo fallacy is Galileo was persecuted for his beliefs. I am persecuted for my beliefs, therefore I am Galileo. The problem that denialists have is, if their arguments are so unassailable, why doesn't everyone believe them? How is it that the alternative truth could have taken hold? And the answer to that has to be a conspiracy, because the presence of a consensus that is often overwhelmingly broad, in the case of things like the existence of the Holocaust or the existence of COVID, that so many different people of so many different kinds with so many different views all believe in the same essential basic facts, at least. The only way you can explain that consensus is according to some kind of conspiracy. Post-truth is a term that has become a little bit less popular than when I started doing these talks, but you still see it a lot. Is it a good term for things like denialism? Well, in some respects, it is not a good term, because denialists emphasize the search for the truth. They are not postmodernists. They are not relativists. In fact, the truth is the term truth is something that you find continually in denialist circles. They are desperate to see themselves as legitimate scholars, as scientists, searching in an unbiased way for the truth. So why is truth so important to them? We have to consider the things that drive denial and denialism. In my book, I talk about what I call the gap. The gap is something that emerged in the post-Enlightenment period in modernity. The gap is between our desires and our ability to speak openly of our desires. In the pre-modern period, there were all sorts of things that one could do by a state, by an individual, by a community, that one could speak of openly. One of those examples is genocide. Genocide has been practiced by human beings on occasions in many different societies at many points in history. There was a time when genocide was something that you wouldn't just own up to, but you would proclaim as a mark of your strength, of your power, as Julius Caesar did in his Gallic Wars. As he says, Caesar writes of himself in the third person in this book. He himself marched to depopulate the country of Ambiorix, whom he had terrified and forced to fly, but despaired of being able to reduce under his power. But he thought it most consistent with his honour to waste his country both of inhabitants, cattle and buildings, so that from the abhorrence of his countrymen, if fortune suffered any to survive, he might be excluded from a return to his state for the calamities which he had brought it. Now, such a statement is very, very hard to imagine today, or indeed really since the 19th century, with a few exceptions. Certainly the Nazis or celebrate genocide of the Jews and other peoples. And certainly neo-Nazis after the war did not do that. The problem was that the desire to commit genocide and other crimes of that kind remains no less strong in the modern period. But what modernity did was to erase the ability to talk about these desires publicly. Because in the modern period, one is supposed to be rational. The state is supposed to be a responsible entity. Science, scholarship, and reason are supposed to prevail. But yet our desires make it very difficult to live up to those ideas. And denialism is one of the ways that you bridge the gap. Denialism is a coded way of speaking of desire. So therefore, the alternative to denial and denialism isn't something very pleasant to witness. The alternative to denialism is not a world where everybody, for example, admits that the Holocaust happened and it was a terrible thing, that global warming is happening and we all must address it. No, the alternative is something much bleaker. The alternative is people who are happy to let climate change proceed unchecked, that celebrate the Holocaust. Obviously not all the same people I'm talking about. These are different sets of people, although sometimes there are overlaps. That the Holocaust happened and it was a good thing, and that one would like to promote a new Holocaust. And you could often find, and in my book I do this, that those very same denialists who are denying that these things have happened come very close to making a coded argument justifying what they deny. So this was posted on a Holocaust denial forum. Why had the Nazis herded them into cattle cars and taken them to extermination camps to dispose once and for all for the Jewish problem? if Hitler had developed a final solution to the Jewish question, there had to have been a Jewish problem. Now, this was taken from a post by someone who was a confirmed Holocaust denier. He seems to have come very, very close to saying, yes, the Holocaust did happen and should have happened and should be completed in our days. But they cannot quite get to the final stage. So that's the denier's alternative. Part of the argument in my book is that we are starting to see a step towards the denier's alternative being embraced. We are starting to see denialism to break down into something, but that something isn't something particularly pleasant to contemplate. I call this post-denialism. Now, Donald Trump really is, I would argue, the standard bearer of post-denialism. This is a tweet that has obsessed me for many years. It was actually from before he ran for president. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Now, this is a very crude argument, obviously. It's an argument that even most Holocaust, so climate change denialists do not make, or at least they don't make it in as crude a terms. And in fact, Donald Trump, as far as I can tell, never actually made this claim ever again. He just threw it out there. And that was the case for a lot of what Donald Trump said. He threw stuff out there. He refused. He denied. He was a denialist. And at the same time, sometimes he wasn't. He moved backwards and forwards. He spewed out a variety of arguments, most of them incoherent, very few of which knitted up together into anything that made up a coherent argument. It was a very unstable form of discourse. In fact, it still is, and it would be today if he was still on Twitter, and God forbid he comes back to Twitter. Post-denialism is a kind of lazy or half-assed kind of denialism. It's denialism that barely seems to bother anymore, that just throws out arguments without creating this sober scholarly front that we are familiar with from denialism. Trump, of course, didn't create post-denialism alone. One of the harbingers of it, if you like, was the internet. But also, I would argue that the 9/11 truth movement, those who argue that the story of the 9/11 attacks is fake. What's interesting about that is this was the first denialist movement that took place and was born in the age of the internet. And unlike earlier denialisms, it never developed the kind of consensus, that scholarly core, pseudo-scholarly core that you find in other denialisms. So there are a variety of theories in the 9/11 truth movement. Some have argued that there were no planes. Some argued that there were planes but no passengers. Some would argue that the buildings had no floors. And the culprits vary from everything from Mossad to the Illuminati and everything in between. My favorite 9/11 truth movement theory was the variant of the no floors theory that argued that the World Trade Center were hollowed out free energy masks. This is part of, as I understand it, people who argue that Tesla Tesla had discovered free energy from the atmosphere and was suppressed by Edison, and the World Trade Center was a Tesla tower that generated free energy from the air. Of course, that theory doesn't really answer why would they destroy it then. So I don't quite understand it, but that's the point. That's what post-denialism is. It's throwing half-baked theories out there that don't necessarily cohere into anything, but their collective effect is to undermine or to attempt to underline truth and consensus. And this kind of reaches its apotheosis in QAnon, which you could argue in a way that it offers a denialism that is so total that it goes beyond denialism into something else. QAnon isn't one theory. There is a core of it, that there is a source, or was during the Trump administration, a source called Q that was working to bring down a global conspiracy of pedophiles who secretly rule the world. Within that, though, there is a vast range of different theories and ideas and schools of thoughts. And Q basically ranges so far that it almost embraces every other kind of denialism that there has ever been, to become an alternative reality, a kind of total skepticism. But it is different in a way to previous denialisms in that nobody's tried to set up an institute of QAnon in the way that Holocaust deniers have set up institutes. No one's created a scholarly journal of Q studies from a pro-Q perspective. It doesn't cohere, but yet it still builds, and it still creates, and it still has, and we've seen it can have devastating effects. So COVID fed into Q, of course, and COVID post-denialism has become a major thing. Here's a couple of examples of COVID post-denialism. The person on the right is President Bolsonaro of Brazil. He's very much in the Trump mold, and his attitude to COVID has been bewildering. He's never quite come out and said it was a hoax. He's never quite said, don't ever distance or don't ever wear masks, but he's alluded to it. He's downplayed it. His response to it has been massively half-assed. He's dismissed health ministers. The Brazilian response to COVID is so catastrophic that new variants of the virus are being born there even now. He isn't a denier that COVID exists. He isn't a denialist about it. He's nothing. He is a post-denialist. He is everything. He is nothing. Another example of that is Lawrence Fox, who is currently, like Piers Corbyn, running for Mayor of London. Again, this is a tweet from him, I think it was a couple of months ago. Just had a large group over to lunch and we hugged and ate and talked and put the world to rights. It was lovely. You'll never take that away from people. Stay out, protect your rights. If the NHS can't cope, then the NHS isn't fit for purpose. Compliance is violence. Now, unlike Piers Corbyn, as far as I'm aware, Lawrence Fox does not deny that COVID exists. He does not say that masks are never appropriate. He doesn't deny that there is a pandemic going on. Rather, what you have is this mixture of acknowledgement and denial that is very, very difficult to pin down. So, going back to the table I put together earlier, here is how denial, denialism, and post-denialism compare. As I said, denial creates silence and denialism creates noise. Post-denialism creates a noisy absence, a profusion of ideas and discourses that somehow have nothing at its heart. Its relation to the truth is multiplicity. It's a multiplicity of truths that are never quite truths. It is produced through a lack of discipline, in a chaotic sort of way. Its relation to scholarship is neither ignorance nor imitation, but of insouciance, almost a kind of not caring. What the alternative is very difficult to say, and how to oppose it is also difficult to say. But one of the things I think we need to acknowledge is that post-denialism might be a stepping stone onto what I call the denier's alternative, to a very different world. there are models now in the world, in the way that there weren't a few decades ago, of people who have ceased to pay lip service to what is speakable in modernity. So on the left is President Duterte of the Philippines, who has said, "I've killed people." I think he once said that he has raped someone, or at least he's come very close to doing with that. He has openly acknowledged his bloodlust in what he considers to be the war on crime. And on the right is the Islamic State, which is now on the retreat, but still very much exists. The Islamic State was in some ways very different from Al-Qaeda, in the sense that it didn't even pay lip service to any sense of being a responsible force. It actively recruited by offering the possibility of rape, of murder, of enslaving others. This was an open acknowledgement of desire in a way that has become extremely rare in modernity. Now, even if you don't like Duterte or Islamic State, the very existence of people of that kind in the world suggests that there are new models for how we relate to our desires in the modern world. And you can see this in the case of COVID, in the sense that there is an emerging current, if you like, in COVID discourse of acknowledging the pandemic and not caring. Last, I think it was October, the White House Chief of Staff said, "We are not going to control the pandemic." They basically said, "We are going to shift to a herd immunity strategy." Now, a herd immunity strategy, while it sounds quite scientific, is basically involves the death of hundreds of thousands at minimum, if not more. It certainly involves the overloading of hospitals. There's a picture there that I apologize hasn't come out very well, but it's from a notice, one of a number of notices that have been posted online from shops in America that say that their staff will not wear masks under any circumstances. And indeed, in parts of the Republican Party, have moved away from denialism of any kind towards saying this is happening, but we are not going to shut down anymore. On January the 6th this year, when the nation's capital was locked down during the insurrection, congressmen and senators gathered in a safe room, and that's a picture from there. And there's an extraordinary video where many of the Republican lawmakers, who were in a fairly closely confined space with their Democratic adversaries, the Republicans would not wear masks. They weren't wearing masks, but not because they said COVID doesn't exist, but because they've said we will not bow down to this. We will not change our behavior, and we will accept the consequences, however bad they may be for others, and indeed for themselves. So are we starting to see the end of denialism? Well, not so fast. I think there are certainly many more models now in the world that give options to those who in previous eras might have embraced denialism for a different way of relating to the truth and their own desires. But it's still a very difficult thing to do, to go beyond denialism. It's still a tough thing to do. And I think the case of Boris Johnson is interesting here. He's someone that certainly at an early stage of the pandemic certainly seemed to have some sense of insouciance about it. There's a very famous clip where he said, "I was in a hospital the other day and shaking hands with everybody." Certainly he would have preferred a herd immunity strategy. Certainly he has given more of an ear to those who would open up the lockdown much earlier than others. The problem is he couldn't quite go that far. He still has enough tying him in to the world of consensus morality, consensus speakability, and consensus truth. In some ways, in Britain, we've had the worst of all worlds for that possibility. Actually, I would say the two world leaders who have had most integrity and moral courage during the pandemic are Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, because they have dealt with the pandemic in a way that is entirely consistent with the way they have lived their entire lives. They have not cared. They have been insouciant about the truth. They have produced chaos, disruption, and mayhem behind them, and they don't care. That takes a certain integrity. That takes consistency. Boris Johnson has vacillated. He doesn't have the courage to do what I suspect, and as I say, that's not very scholarly, what I suspect he would like to do at some point, to break free and to embrace the denier's alternative, or at least post-denialism. So how would we respond to a post-denialist age? The irony is that what has sometimes been called post-truth may actually pave the way for a more truthful politics. A more truthful politics in the sense of acknowledging the truth of one's own desires. But can we handle that? Can we handle people who say we should do nothing about climate change and Bangladesh should drown? Can we handle those who openly advocate genocide? Well, there are some possibilities here. Perhaps there are possibilities in reckoning with a previously hidden moral diversity. One of the things about climate change that frustrates me is we've never actually had a proper debate. We have never had a debate where people who want action against climate change debate those who don't want action on climate change, because those who don't want action on climate change are usually denialists. There's possibility here of a truly free speech, of a politics that is shorn of delusion. None of this is a very pleasant prospect. But I think one of the things we've seen from the lockdown, the COVID era, is that we may have to get used to thinking the unthinkable and meeting and engaging with a world that might be quite different to the world that some of us grew up in. Thank you. I hope that worked and there was not too many technical screw-ups.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. It was fascinating, and I'm not sure if it was more scary at the thought of this being in the open, or maybe if it was in the open we could actually tackle it. I don't know. We'll have to see, and perhaps we'll get some questions raised about that coming up. Mentioning questions, something that often happens when we've got a riveting talk like this. The chat goes quite quiet, and we get very few questions through, which is happening, which I always think is a really good thing, because it means people are really interested in paying attention. So if you've been saving up your questions, then head over to Slido and put them in now. We've got space.
Can I just do some shameless flattery? But it's actually genuinely sincere, and I've said this in other Skeptics in the Pub talks. I do get a better quality of questions here. We have great discussions, and I'm very happy to take questions, however skeptical.
Brilliant. We love you already. I mean, that's it. Yeah, I bet there's cheering and clapping in the chat there. Before we finish, I'll just mention that next week we've got Deborah Hyde. She'll be talking about the Vampire of Crogling Grange. That's a homegrown Northumbrian beast. So come back next week. But first of all, head on over to Slido. We'll be back at 8:05. So charge your glasses, have your wheeze, do whatever else you must do. And we'll see you back at 8:05. Thanks. And thank you for lighting up the questions in Slido. We have loads of really interesting questions to look at, so that's great. I've got one sad announcement to make to begin with. In pet related, Unfortunately, Keith's cat is downstairs and not available to come and say hello to everybody. So
if this is a thing, then I'll get my son to bring. Is this a thing?
Yes.
I'll get my son to bring him up.
If you would, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, everyone was going to have to send the love.
Right.
Send your son a text. Get him. Isn't it wonderful when you can text your kids from another room?
Well, that doesn't mean he's going to reply.
Well, we'll give it a go. We have a cat loving and dog loving audience here. So what's your cat called?
Luna, Luna.
Luna.
As in the moon. She's all white.
Right. Oh, beautiful. Yes. We did have a cat-related unfortunate accident with Dean Burnett, who was here a few weeks ago, because the cat came to say hello and then changed his mind.
She's definitely going to change her mind.
Yes. And I think Dean, blood wasn't quite drawn, I think.
We'll see. She's a very nice cat. She's just isn't particularly interested in Skeptics talks.
Maybe now. Anyway, so let's have a look at some of the questions. The question at the top, the first question I'm going to ask is from S. Hunts. And she asks, are denialists generally working from an altruistic basis, educating the world to their incorrect views, or do they have more sinister, selfish purposes?
The first thing to say is thanks for the fab questions. They're always fab. As I said, Skeptics in the pub. And I'm sorry to those who that I won't be able to get around to. There were several questions like this about motivations. And I tend to be, on the one hand, I'm quite wary of inferring too much about motivation because I'm, as a sociologist, although I didn't quite write the book with my purely academic hat on because it's not a purely academic book, I'm still quite wary of reading in motivations. On the other hand, I do talk about desire. So I am talking about motivations as well. I think we have to judge people. I think that there is a tendency to overestimate the self-interestedness of certain kinds of denialisms. So certainly with climate change denialism, it's sometimes dismissed as being a creature of the oil industry to preserve profits. Now, that's certainly true in some cases. It's certainly true that some people are trying to do that and that the oil industry has funded denialist work. But it's interesting that there is a bit of a split within the climate change denialist community that sometimes rises to the surface, but most of the time you don't really see it, between those who are doing it for sort of perhaps more cynical reasons and those who really mean it, in the sense that it may be in the self-interest of oil companies to preserve their profits by promoting denialism. And it will be worthwhile to do that until such time as it isn't worthwhile. In the same way that tobacco companies, it was in their interest to deny things until it wasn't, until it became time to switch to vaping and finding other sources of profits. But there's a hardcore that are doing it as part of a much more broader worldview. And one can see perhaps that in any vision of how a world should be, that there is an element of altruism, even if your vision of how the world should be is against altruism, as in the thought of some libertarian ideologies. So yes, in some respects, there is an altruism towards it, in the sense that this is about ideals and values. But I think with some people, it's extremely difficult to see what motivates people. I find there was a question elsewhere about Toby Young.
Yeah, I'll just tell you, it was Andrew in Peterborough, actually, who said, what do people like Toby Young get out of it, of COVID denial? Is it attention-seeking, confrontational?
I find I'm a bit obsessed with Toby Young. I find him fascinating because I can't work out precisely that question. And here is where I feel sort of split. There's always a temptation on Twitter to sort of cut loose. And I've resisted the temptation to say what I suspect but cannot justify in any way. All right, maybe I'll say it. Maybe I'll say it.
We'll say it here.
I'll say it here. Maybe I'll say it. His father. People heard of his father? I don't know. You can't respond back at me. You can't nod your head.
I don't actually. Other people are probably more knowledgeable than me, but I don't.
His father, Lord Young, was a great man. He was one of the key people behind the post-war welfare state consensus. He helped to build the Open University. As a sociologist, he did pioneering studies of family and kinship in East London. He was a social entrepreneur. He was, although he did help intercede to get Toby Young into Oxford, that's on the record. He was a man who built stuff. He was a scholar and an activist. And I think it's quite extraordinary how the personality that Toby Young has built for himself is the antithesis of his father. But on the other hand, as a scholar, with my scholarly hat on, I can't justify that at all. I've never met the guy. I don't know who he is outside of Twitter and seeing him on TV or reading articles that he's written. And that's the problem. There is a basic problem in knowing what goes on inside people's heads. What I do feel confident in saying that runs across all denialisms is that common thread of desire. Desire that comes in certain forms because it requires a certain kind of passion, if you like, to embrace this way of relating to the world. You know, it's not easy. It's not easy to be Toby Young. It's not easy to be Melanie Phillips. It's not easy to be someone who there are costs that come to it. And some people perhaps enjoy that because it feeds the kind of Galileo fallacy. But for other people, it's shattering. You know, people have lost friends through this. They've lost family. They have lost respect in the world. There has to be some passionate desire that must motivate that. And I think I have some ideas about what that means. Beyond that, there is a lot that has to be down to, as with everything else, the individual idiosyncrasies of biography and psychology and personality and so on.
Yeah, so they're getting so much out of it that it's worth losing family and friends. But what that is a little bit more difficult to pin down.
Well, I think this responds to, I can't remember which question. There was another question. The flip side of that is that, sorry, while I'm talking, I'm gonna WhatsApp my daughter because my son wasn't doing it.
Cycle through the children. Then it's my wife if we're really desperate. The flip side is that you can also find something wonderful. You can find community. Mm. You can find support. You can find that thrilling sense of having discovered something, of seeing behind the veil of the way the world is supposed to be. I sometimes feel a bit jealous of that. I kind of feel that the world I live in is pretty dolefully complex and difficult and complicated and awkward and tough to understand. That sense of part of being this sort of empowered, liberated people who can see the way the world is. I've had a debate with this by a friend of mine online who's done some work in this area, specific on conspiracy theories and denialisms. And he says most of the denialists I've met are really bitter people who've really suffered and quite twisted through it. And he says that I overemphasize the positives of it, the thrills of it. But I think I'm right. But I think that there is the thrills of it outweigh the costs, I think. There's sort of part of, when you were talking there, that reminded me that having found a community, I remember having those kind of feelings the first time I went to QED, to a big Skeptics conference. But what was missing from what you're saying is while I found community,
hold that thought.
I didn't feel superior, and we have a cat. What's her name?
Luna.
Oh, Luna said
200 people online, or at least there were, and there's a tradition of people showing their cats. Hello.
Oh, she's absolutely beautiful.
She is gorgeous. Which she's told.
She was in Mum's office.
She was in my wife's office. We were told that she's not allowed to go out the front by the vet because white cats like this get stolen, apparently.
Because they're just too cute.
Because they're just too cute, my daughter said. All right, she's running away.
Yeah, she's doing the cat thing. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, daughter.
Thank you, Ella. No, you said, so you went to the QED conference and you felt this sense of being...
That sense of community, the sense of belonging, the sense of having found a home, all those kind of things. And I think a lot of people there would say the same thing, but not that we are... What was missing from what you said was that extra bit, which is, aren't we clever? Look at, we know something everybody else doesn't. That wasn't there. It was much more down to earth.
So that's really interesting, because I know a little bit about the US skeptic community, and my encounters with the UK skeptic community and adjacent cultures. So I often quite write for New Humanist magazine. So that's the National Secular Society, I think.
Yeah.
And in Britain, it doesn't seem to have that smugness. In America, it often comes dangerously close to forming a culture that isn't a million miles away from that. And there's a character in the US, very famous in the US skeptic community and fairly well known over here, called Michael Shermer, who's written multiple debunking books, and for quite a long time he was a self-defined global warming skeptic. Eventually he changed his mind about that, and it just does show how the particular cultures, when they see themselves as us against the world, which I can understand in America you might well do, give it in the skeptic community, how it can lead to a particular sort of culture that can be quite toxic in multiple ways. I just want to add one caveat to what we should certainly take some more questions to what I said earlier, which is quite important when we talk about the possible thrills of being a denialist. There are some sections of society and some parts of the world where it is standard norm, it's the norm, where it is the consensus. One of the things we know now about America, at the very, very least, global warming denialism is the consensus across vast swathes of American society. In some countries, certain forms of genocide denialisms are the consensus. If you go to Turkey, the consensus is the genocide of the Armenians never happened, for example. In that sense, there's no, and in those sorts of cases, those sort of experiential pleasures of denialism are going to be much less because it's just the norm. The trick there is to ensure that if you are a Turkish person who wants to talk about the Armenian genocide, that you don't end up forming your own subculture that resembles denialist subculture, which is, I think, is kind of what you see in sections of the US skeptic community, which is very unfortunate.
That leads on nicely to another question. It was about the difference between being a denialist and being a skeptic.
I think the point is that it's very common for denialists to call themselves skeptics because it's a much more acceptable term. And there was a question about this. No denialist calls themselves a denialist. It's a slur. And I sometimes feel a bit guilty about using it because it's quite a brutal term to use. And I don't like using it, but I think it is just the best term. I think skepticism, it depends what skepticism you're talking about. The sort of idea of skepticism that I can get behind and I think seems normative as far as I can see within the UK skeptic community is an injunction to question, to be interested, and above all, to grapple with things that are difficult and complicated and inconvenient to understand. Now, to me, that's a skepticism that I can absolutely sign me up to. The sort of skepticism that becomes much more problematic it is one that is, as I say, smug, and that is insufficiently self-aware about the dangers of doing it yourself. Because we can all, the skepticism that I talk about that I can get behind isn't about, for example, all of us being experts on what dark matter is. It's about being interested in the work of those who know about this sort of stuff, and also in the differences between them. Because there are differences and there are different theories. Skepticism becomes toxic, and it becomes something that can certainly lead to denialism, is when you take upon yourself, regardless of one's own expertise and background, the ability to debunk everything. Now that becomes very, very dangerous.
Absolutely. Do your own research.
Yes, and that's the term you see all the time online. Do your own research. Well, no, I can't do research on dark matter because I don't. Because I'm not a astrophysicist.
And there's another question, really, because we see this from across the board, this kind of do your own research. It refers to so many things. And we have a question from Anonymous here, who asks if denialism is equally rife on both the left and the right of the political spectrum, and if it's the same thought processes.
Well, you could certainly say, I mean, the denialisms on the right are well known, and you can find equivalents on the left as you understand it. You can certainly see within, for example, in the Soviet Union, you can see, for example, Lysenkoism during the Stalin's period, which is very much was a kind of denialist form of scholarship. You can certainly see defenders of the old Soviet Union today denying the purges, that kind of thing. But so, yes, you do find it there. I'm not sure whether it's equally. I'm not sure you can judge it in those terms. But what I think is most interesting is, particularly with post-denialism as well as denialism itself, it might be the thing that seems to break apart the difference between left and right, and create kind of new kinds of political affinities and crossover. People talk about the horseshoe, that left and right crossover. I don't think it's simple as it's not as linear as a horseshoe. Is that linear? I think it's linear.
Linear in it's a non-straight linear one.
Yeah, something like that is a non-straight linear, as a horseshoe would imply. But what we're seeing is a great example of this actually is Syria. And if you look online, there are a whole the denialism about Assad's atrocities and massacres and use of chemical weapons in Syria has become a marker almost of self-identity amongst some sections of the left and some sections of the right. But it's not just that they're meeting. I think it's to do with creating new kinds of political solidarities. So there was a picture posted, I think it was last year, or a couple of years ago, of Steve Bannon meeting and having a friendly conversation with George Galloway at a conference. It was either Russia or somewhere in the Central Asian states. Now, that's not because someone very left-wing and someone very right-wing are meeting each other. It's because they are starting to work through a different way of looking at the world, that they may have stuff in common with and stuff that's not in common with. So I'm wary of the horseshoe idea, whilst acknowledging that this phenomena does exist in some respects.
Right. Moving on to a question that I think a lot of us have asked when we find ourselves being drawn into conversations. It's from Trevor Smith, who asks, does denialism thrive on the oxygen of publicity, and would it die without it?
I think the first thing to say is, pre-internet, a lot of this stuff was in very dark corners and was pretty obscure. I remember I was I'm 49 years old, so I remember a time pre-internet, and I was always fascinated by Holocaust denial, partly because I'm Jewish, but not just because of that. And I didn't have contacts in those worlds. So I never saw that kind of stuff. I knew it existed, but I wasn't part of that milieu. And to become part of that milieu I could have done it probably, would have taken effort and would have required me writing to people and seeking out people and maybe take a few risks. Whereas these days you can just stumble about it. So denialism can exist under even the least promising circumstances and can nurture within itself a kind of self-righteous subculture. Also, there are some forms of denialism that have worked quietly as well. We find out that information is still coming out about the activities of both some of the oil companies and also the tobacco industry to work very quietly behind the scenes to undermine scientific research in various ways. So that didn't need publicity for it to work. All that said, I used to think that we had to just live with the fact that today everybody has a platform, and that publicity is something that is there, whether we respond or not. It is there, it is out there, and people can find each other easily. I used to think that. I still do think that to a degree, but I've been given some pause to think about that by, I think, quite the effect of Donald Trump being banned from Twitter, which it doesn't mean that any of those ideas have gone away. It doesn't mean that he's gone away. It doesn't mean that his influence has gone away. But that ever-present sense that the poisonous sense of him constantly spewing out semi-truths and untruths all day, every day, in the middle of the night, I wouldn't say that's transformed political discourse, but I think it's had an effect on political discourse. And so there is my view used to be, if you deplatform someone from one platform, another one will pop up. And that's true to an extent. But the problem with, say, for example, platforms for the far right, like Gab or Parler, which I think the latter has been closed down, is they become echo chambers, and it means you can't recruit people into them quite as easily as you might used to have.
Yeah. So go elsewhere. That's fine.
So to some extent, I didn't think. I think depriving the oxygen of publicity, I have a little bit more faith than I did that was a possible strategy.
So it's a similar-ish question. It's linked. Emily asks, how can you differentiate between holding an unpopular opinion that goes against society's consensus and being in denial?
Well, this is where you feel the ground beneath your feet giving way. And you start, this is very difficult. And I think most of us have had those times where we felt, is everybody else wrong, or is it just me? How do you trust yourself? How do you know? How can you see the world without feeling like you're going mad if you go against what you see? And of course, there are times when it is essential to hold unpopular opinion. As denialists often say, a lot of today's mainstream consensus truths came because somebody had a different idea, because Einstein questioned Newton. It was obviously more complicated than that, but you know what I mean. To me, what's key here is do your research, but in a different way to that slogan. Do your research. What it should mean is humility. It should mean exposing yourself to different views, to using your critical faculties, but also recognizing the limitations of your own abilities, and not simply seeking out like minds because that's easier, but also asking difficult questions of those like minds too.
So that's really interesting, because somebody else asked something quite similar to that saying, so that's the individual advice you're giving. What about public policies? An anonymous person asks. How are there data-backed solutions like Finland's critical thinking in schools, for instance?
So I know that Finland, I don't know about that particular thing, but I do know that Finland is seen as having the world's best education system. I'm actually currently learning Finnish via Duolingo, as it happens.
We have Finnish people here.
I know.
Yes, Matty.
Moi, as they say. I did a talk. I was on a panel a couple of years ago, about some of these issues, and we all bemoan the fact that a lot of these discussions end up by saying, "Oh, we need better education," right? And the problem is that everyone says we need better education, but how that education works is the difficult thing. I certainly think there is something fundamentally wrong with certain elements of the current national curriculum in some areas. I certainly think that, I mean, okay, I went to school 30 years ago, but I think some things, from looking at my kids' school books, haven't changed that much. I felt that, I dropped science. I did one science GCSE and I dropped the rest like the plague, because science in the school was the most austere. It was learning a series of rules, and experiments weren't really experiments. We did experiments, but they weren't, we knew what we were supposed to find. And it was only when I started reading popular science books when I was in my 20s, so people like James Gleick or someone like Daniel Dennett and stuff like that I felt that I'd been robbed of something. An idea of science that is a form of radical doubt that's also empowering, but not radical skepticism in that nihilist kind of skepticism, but constantly questioning yourselves and being suffused with wonder. I mean, I have quite a lot of problems with Richard Dawkins for all sorts of reasons, but Dawkins at his best, and his best was quite a long time ago, was very, very good at trying to communicate that sense of wonder. So that's one of the things I think we're missing. The other thing is, in terms of social media training, I don't think we've even begun to do. I mean, my kids have had, I can't remember what they call it, enrichment classes and form time where they look at social media, but it's not part of the core. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we've all been hit. It feels like sometimes we've been hit by a truck with something that is radically new, radically different, that is having unfolding effects at bewildering speeds, and those of us who are in the generation that should be educating don't really know how to respond to it ourselves. But it seems to me that that certainly kids aren't getting that training, and the adults, my God. I've seen people, and Dawkins again is an example of this, of people who have had a lifetime of who've changed and become something different once they encounter the internet and lose some of that suppleness, some of that sense of wonder and curiosity, and become hunkered down. I don't know how that. I mean, I'm sure there's some good curricula and some good projects in some places that I'm not aware of, but it's certainly not rolled out widely, and it shouldn't be just for kids.
Yeah, yes, the rest of us need it too.
Sure.
So, moving on from the process, what about outcomes? Andy Wilson says, "Thank you for the talk. Can you share any examples or stories of how people have emerged from denialism into thinking differently, either contemporary or historic?"
That is a fantastic question. And I suppose it's a criticism of my doleful view of the world that is certainly in my book. I didn't talk a great deal of. I can give you one example of, it's not really what you're asking. I can give you two. I can give you an example of something that you're talking about. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the person involved. There is in Texas. There is an evangelical Christian woman who has made it her life's work to talk with evangelical Christian audiences about climate change and to get them to take it seriously and acknowledge that it's happening and to leave denial and denialism behind. As I say, I can't remember her name. You'll have to Google to find out who it is. One of the things that when I read about her work, that impressed upon me is that she is able to do it because she talks people's language. She's able to say, you don't have to people, I am one of you. You don't have to give up anything essential about yourself in order to recognize that climate change exists. She deals with the theological issues. She talks to people in a language that people understand. Now, I confess, what I've read about her I haven't seen stuff talking about people who've been through that process have come out the other side. But my understanding is that there are people who have been through that. Here's a less upbeat example. And again, it's not quite what he was asking, but I think it's instructive. And I used to, when I've talked about this when I've talked about denialism in talks and Skeptics in the Pub before, but there was a book that made a big impression on me. It was published about 10 years ago by a woman called Bettina Stangneth. It was about Adolf Eichmann during the time when he was in hiding, semi-hiding in fact, in Argentina before he was kidnapped by the Israelis and put on trial in Jerusalem in 1961, I think it was. And he was close to a circle of Nazi sympathizers who were all either Argentinian or were in exile from Europe, including some former SS people. And these were people who weren't at the upper echelons. And in the immediate post-war period, they were hearing all this stuff about the Holocaust. And they didn't really know. They were too low down to really know what had happened. They knew there was persecution of the Jews. They knew there was killing, but they didn't know the extent of it. And their first reaction was to say, these are lies. These are lies. So they got Adolf Eichmann in to this salon, and he basically saying what happened, and he asked them what happened. And these sessions were recorded. And during these sessions, Eichmann laid out the details of what happened with considerable pride about what he'd done, which was very different from the tone he took later in Jerusalem when he said he was just a humble functionary fulfilling orders. This was something that he clearly approved of, and he found his involvement pleasurable. What I found interesting about this book and about that particular moment is you've got the people in that room were confronted with a choice. And that choice was, do we embrace celebration and acknowledgement? Can we deal with this? Can we adopt Eichmann's tone and be proud of what the Nazis did? Or should we hush it up? And none of them could go as far as Eichmann did. Most of them fell back into, if not denialism, they fell back into denial, in the sense that they didn't talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. But the fact that they didn't fall into denialism is interesting, because they couldn't, because somebody who was there confronted them with stuff that they could deny, they could not talk about, that they could silence, that they could marginalize, but they couldn't argue against. Now, there is a value in personal encounters with people who are at things that can cut through things like denialism. I don't believe that the vanishing numbers of Holocaust survivors can, of themselves, stop Holocaust denial. I don't feel that those who survived the 9/11 attacks can in themselves stop 9/11 9/11 denialism. I don't believe that Inuit in Canada can stop climate change denialism, but it can certainly help in the sense that there is a sense that personal experience and personal encounter can reach out to us beyond the defences that we pull up. It's not quite the question I was asked, but that's my answer.
So I think this is linked. Do we give too much respect to opinions that are just wrong or harmful?
Well, that depends on who's giving the respect.
We're often, sometimes when we get into conversations, which we may wish we hadn't got into with people who think strange things, we try to be respectful, but on the I don't know if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Well, I mean, I think there are two separate sides of this. One of this is a question about platforming again. And as I've said, I think that in some circumstances there is a case for non-platforming and trying to marginalise people. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I agreed with the BBC's decision not to put climate change denialists as the other side in debates about climate change. That's one form of respect. The other is about how you engage. The question, the dilemma is this, and certainly with online discussions, disrespectful encounters tend not to work very well, and they tend there's that phrase, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it. And I'm not calling denialist pigs or anything like that, but I think there's a certain wisdom in that truth. Certainly when on the rare occasions when I do get into Twitter spats, and I try and avoid it wherever possible, I don't feel good afterwards, and I don't feel I've actually achieved anything. I think there can be a value in a certain kind of respectful engagement if it is well thought through, in the sense of giving people enough rope to hang themselves can work. So I don't know if anybody saw David Baddiel's documentary on Holocaust denial. It came about a year ago, maybe, came out. He actually spent 5 hours. I actually spent 5 hours of him being interviewed by him for this documentary, and in the end, he sent me a very apologetic email saying, "I'm afraid that we were running long and I had to cut it." But it was a very interesting program because it was about his personal quest and all that, and he wanted to meet a Holocaust denier, and most of the people he met, including Deborah Lipstadt, said, "Do not do this. Don't meet them. Don't put them on your documentary." But he did, and I think it worked. He didn't go in there all guns blazing, shouting at him, being nasty to them. He didn't, and here I think he took my advice, which is when he asked my advice and said, "Don't get into arguments about the facts because it just can't work. It will never work." What he did do is he created an environment whereby first of all, it was an Irish Holocaust denier. He chose the right one. He chose one who was an idiot, who wasn't very good at it, who wrote weird Holocaust denial songs that were just a bit shit. And he let him destroy himself by showing himself. Now, you can only do that. There are some Holocaust deniers who are much more better at their job, who wouldn't do that. So I think there's a value in that sometimes, that a sort of calculated, sincere respectfulness can, on certain occasions, lure people out into a position where they can discredit themselves, and perhaps, who knows, even question their own ideas.
Right. The next question, I've actually been looking forward to hearing your answer on. It's from Mark, who asked, can people hear me?
I can hear you.
I'll carry on anyway. Apparently I may have frozen. I may have frozen. So I don't know if you want to repeat the question. Oh, yeah, apparently they can hear me. So, right, you just got you're saved from watching me move. So the next question is, how do you see the current war on woke and the cancel culture debate? Do you think that they might be proxy for being able to be open and honest about racism, etc.? Are they
I think certainly they can be. I think they can be. They can be that proxy, but I think there's much more than that going on. Going on than that, and something that we should take much more seriously. I am finding the debate about the war on woke and cancel culture somewhat bewildering, because it's very, very unclear what people actually mean. And sometimes people have well thought out positions here that are based on a serious critique of the way some views are marginalized and why people can't hear about certain things. And sometimes they are a coded attempt to create their own, if you like, counter cancellation. And sometimes they're simply in bad faith. So what we have is something that is very much of our age, which is a debate that is so chaotic, where we can't even agree on what the basic terms of the debate are. And going back to denialism, this isn't the same phenomenon exactly, but it seems to be quite similar to the post-denialist moment, in the sense that nothing really quite coheres. And I think in some cases, it is that lack of coherence that is precisely the point. The weaponization, if you like, of an argument that doesn't have a clear referent, of using sort of stock phrases in ways that are almost quite empty. The problem is, and I think the sad thing about it is, there will always need to be a debate about free speech and its limits and how we cope with diverse opinions. And it's a serious debate, and it needs to happen. The great tragedy is the fact that some people are weaponizing these concerns in this chaotic, incoherent way is causing people who perhaps should engage a little bit more in issues of free speech and ask themselves some difficult questions, will not ask those questions. And so what that leads me to say is those who genuinely really are interested in this have well thought out positions about limitations of free speech and how speech is policed, need to abandon those terms, because they have no purpose at the moment. They've become empty, and the emptiness is toxic. So I feel I've answered every question kind of sideways, but right. I hope it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to go into that a bit more about whether just the thought that comes into my head are these people complaining about Dr. Seuss's estate, choosing not to publish some books because they were racist. My thought was to echo what Mark said: is, are those people just being racist and not wanting to say so?
I think there's also contrarianism. I think contrarianism has become a big thing, and I think again it's part of that post-denialist milieu. The sense that if somebody who I see as a threat does something that I see as a threat, then I will do the opposite. And that there's a kind of nihilism to that, as well as yes, often in those cases, racism. And I think also, in fairness, at times there is a genuine confusion that I think bedevils debates about free speech. And here we may come back to the education question. Debates about free speech are often confused for debates about platforms, because you can have completely free speech in society but still be excluded from some platforms. And actually, everybody, the joke of it all is everyone agrees with that. You know, if Toby, coming back to Toby Young and his free speech union, of course, Toby Young, doesn't believe that advocates of paedophilia should be published in the Daily Telegraph. Of course he doesn't believe that. There are only a minuscule minority of complete free speech absolutists. Tiny, tiny minority. That's the joke of it all. None of us are free speech absolutists. All of us believe in deplatforming in some cases. All of us all of us believe that certain people should be cancelled. The debate is about who, what, and how. And that's one of the things that's been lost in here. And again, as I say, the incoherence, from some people, the incoherence is the point.
As you said, noise. So I've got a question coming up from Anonymous. There's so many interesting questions here, and I think we've got to try it. We won't promise not to keep you all night. What about tackling denialism, but particularly by academics and other really respected people, Elon Musk? How can we tackle it?
I think this is a common phenomenon. I think the wrong way of dealing with it is to cancel a Nobel laureate who does this sort of thing, and say that the entirety of their work is retrospectively invalid. Elon Musk, I think, is a slightly different case. I think he's a very eccentric individual in certain respects, and very, very idiosyncratic. Look, you will find in most forms of denialism, you will find, certainly in classic denialism, you will find university professors signing up to it. That has always been the case. That will always be the case. And it's something that one has to be relatively phlegmatic about and accept the inevitability that scholars and academics may be brilliant in some areas and quite wacky, to say the least, in others. That's what it is to be a human being. So it's not something that I think we should get particularly angry or frustrated with. It's an inevitability. And actually, it's a possible way of doing education about what academia actually is, and what it means to be a scholar, and what it means to be an expert, and about the limitations of scholarly expertise, and about the dangers, and also about what happens when scholars move outside their own particular silos. I mean, people could accuse that of me. You know, like you did your PhD on extreme metal, so why are you pontificating about denialism? Actually, as it happens, this is a much longer conversation. The ideas behind my work on metal have actually fed into my ideas on denialism, but that's a thing for another day. I think that I only work partially within academia, but that's quite useful because it means that I get to see people's views about academia, which are often a little bit bizarre, and often sometimes overestimate what it means to be a professor or to have a PhD, and sometimes underestimated too. I think academia is something that needs to be radically demystified. Not that it isn't valuable, not that there isn't amazing stuff coming out of universities and that scholarship is essential, but that we need to see it as a human activity performed by fallible human individuals.
Right. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted because we're worried about keeping you up all night. So we'll probably just go for another couple of questions.
Should we take something that's about COVID? I don't know if there is anything, because maybe there isn't actually. Someone asked you about the wonderful fish mural behind you.
I'm going to. There's a couple. There's one I'm interested in, and I'm going to ask you. Maybe not. Maybe make this a short one. But I can't, because Grimbeard says he's asking about the differences and similarities between approaching this question as a sociologist compared to psychologists. Is it to do with collective versus individual? Or?
So this is also an issue about demystifying academia. The dividing line between sociology and psychology is actually pretty porous. So I mentioned at the very start of my talk this evening, I mentioned Stanley Cohen's work. Now, one of his closest collaborators in his work on, he was a sociologist. One of his closest collaborators was a woman called Bruna Seu, who is a psychologist. I teach part-time in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck College, which is designed deliberately to be something that crosses over sociology and psychology. The caveat here is that experimental psychology is a very different thing, and that often doesn't feed into sociology at all.
Yeah.
Certainly, I would say that what interests me I'm slightly bifurcated. As an individual, I'm fascinated by denialists. I'm fascinated by Toby Young. I'm fascinated by David Irving and all these sorts of people. But with my more professional hat on, what I'm interested in is in the worlds that denialists build, right, and the cultures that they create and the communities they create. And that seems to be something that leads a little bit more towards sociology. And to me, I find it more, whilst as I've said, I'm fascinated by questions of motivation, but I also recognise the imponderabilities of that, and of that sort of thing.
So you need a psychologist to look inside people's heads while you look at worlds that. Except
that's not exactly what all psychologists do. You know, that's the problem. We're talking about these vastly disparate disciplines that I'm almost at a loss to describe what they actually are at this point.
Yeah, but there's, I suppose, one of my things is actually, you need the different disciplines approaching the same thing from different points of view to get to a better answer, don't you?
I think. Look, I am an interdisciplinarist, and I'm also someone who doesn't stay within their silo. But I would like to think that everything I do, even when it doesn't look like it, even when I wrote my book about Kinder Surprise eggs, it's coming out in November, has a bedrock that comes from my training of a particular kind of sociological training that I received at Cambridge University and Goldsmiths College in the 1990s. That's where my own particular roots are, but that's just one sociology.
Right. So the next question, just going to ask you a couple more questions now. The next question comes from Igor, who is joining us all the way from Russia, so it's some unearthly hour for him at the moment. And he's asking about the future. He says, can you predict the future a bit? What's next? Post-denialism and total rejection of the concept of reality? Insidious doublespeak cults? Something else?
It's hard not to feel a little bit apocalyptic at the moment. And I do personally tend towards pessimism. But I am very, very struck at the sheer... I'm not saying that everybody who voted for Trump was a QAnon supporter and a believer in all that sort of stuff. But there are more than enough who were to be deeply concerning about the existence of, even in just one country, and of course it's not just one country, of a substantial minority of the population who understand the world in a way that is so radically different that it's almost impossible to have any common ground on which to build. In terms of what's next, if I had to hazard a prediction, I think we are moving towards. We're in a transitional phase in which it will become more and more common to see views advocated in public that we haven't seen advocated in public, some for a very long time. I think that there is currently a veneer of democratic discourse over sections of the American Republican right, but the veneer is becoming worn very, very thin. And I wouldn't blame people in the Georgia Republican Party to think, why are we going through all these incredibly complex circumlocutions to try and prevent black people from voting? Why don't we prevent black people from voting? Why are we bothering with this? Why are we bothering with elections? We had this in the past. You know, we spent. Imagine if you're a racist right in the southern states, they have spent almost a century and a half now, trying one thing after another to try and perpetuate apartheid. These, the Jim Crow laws, there were these vastly complex forms of electoral discrimination that were supposedly swept away in the 60s. And so they had to spend decades building them up again another way. They've tried and tried and tried. Well, one strategy is locked down, they try the next. Maybe they should say, you know what? We aren't Democrats. And we believe that the black people should not vote, or at least not black people of a particular kind. I would imagine people getting very tired of all this bullshit, and saying, and those sorts of views to become more common. And I think we're getting, in America, we're very close to that. I think in Britain, we still have some way to go. And it's not a deterministic path. It doesn't mean that every society will necessarily end that way. And of course, there are multiple different ways of pushing back. But I do get this sense of a move towards honesty. And which I saw paradoxically enough in the Brexit debate. One of the interesting things is that over time, since 2016, how the argument that Britain would be materially better off after Brexit fell away, and a lot of the leading Brexiters and also grassroots people were saying, we want Brexit and we will take a material hit. We will be poorer, probably temporarily, but we will still do that. Now, that kind of, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad point of view, actually, but I think it's a more honest point of view. And I don't think we're necessarily prepared to know how to deal with political honesty anymore, because we've been so accustomed to these convoluted ways of indirectly arguing for political positions. And that will have some terrible consequences, but it may also have some positive consequences. It seems to me that the honesty may be the next step, but it may be an honesty that is not particularly pleasant.
It's be a horrible honesty. It's a honesty that goes, I'm completely prepared to lose my hand as long as you lose your arm.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody believed in Brexit. There may be some people who supported Brexit on this call, and I know that people supported Brexit for multiple different reasons. Some of them better than others. I'm not a Brexiter, but I'm saying that in the Brexit debate I thought that was actually paradoxically healthy. That people aren't arguing for it on the basis of materialism, but saying that some things are more important than material reality. In the same way, there is something paradoxically healthy about the fact that you actually had people attacking the Capitol in Washington, D.C. This wasn't this was open. This was on there. I mean, yes, it still had a veneer, and maybe when something's out there, we can actually deal with it.
So maybe a nicer analogy is a boil bursting.
Possibly.
Oh, I'm being too
possibly. It may be that we've become so convoluted as human beings that we've forgotten how it is to say what it is. This is what I want. This is deep speculation, and I could be entirely wrong. But at the moment, I think we might be heading in that direction. But of course, there'll be many twists and turns.
I am going to have to dramatically lighten the mood now for our question, because I will need a gin and tonic. But first of all, Justin has got a much more refreshing question. He wonders if you've got any metal music recommendations, and I think there's probably quite a few people might like to hear this.
Well, do you want something incredibly silly? Because one of the things that's got me through lockdown, see, it used to be, my PhD was, my book was on extreme metal. I write a lot about it, about the sort of the harder end, sort of more avant-garde ends of metal. But in lockdown, all the metal I've been listening to is ridiculous, stupid metal. Not all of it. I've been listening to some decent stuff too. And there is, if you want to put a smile on your face, you should check out a band called Glory Hammer. who's songwriter Christopher Bowes does a really good Twitch stream occasionally, and the bassist also does one as well if you're interested. And they're completely ridiculous. It's what's known as power metal. It's got a lot of synth, and it's all about this imaginary world set in the future in Dundee, and this intergalactic war between Angus MacFife, the King of Dundee, and Zargathrax. I can't remember who the goodie and the bad. I think Angus MacFife is the goodie and Zargathrax is the bad one. And all the albums are complex albums, and they're ridiculous, but enormous fun, and they will put an absolute smile on your face.
So that was Glory Hammer.
Glory Hammer. And also the songwriter for Glory Hammer, although he doesn't appear on stage with them, is a guy called Christopher Bowes, who's in the Scottish pirate metal band. He lives in Kentucky now. A pirate metal band called Ailstorm, who are also enormous fun.
Pirate metal?
What'd you say?
Did you say pirate metal?
Pirate metal is a subgenre, yeah. There are all these bands that sing about pirates.
Wonderful.
Also, if you want another pirate...
We've got some support for Ailstorm here. Coming in.
I'm not... I can't see I had to close down the Twitch thing, so I can't see it. Basically, Ailstorm will change your life, probably for the worse, but in a good way. And if you want... Yeah, I'll stick with the fun stuff.
Right, Glory Hammer and Ailstorm, thank you very much for that. My spirits needed lifting a bit there.
Sure, absolutely. Mine too.
But you have given us so much food for thought, and I'm sorry we've kept you so long, but people wanted to carry on listening to you. So thank you so much for your time. We're moving to a pub shortly, our online pub. But first of all, can I thank Malcolm and Matty, who've been our broadcast text tonight and helped us. They solved a little tricky problem there earlier. And also to Kelly, who's been my backup, and she's been managing the Slido questions.
So thanks for organising. I mean, this is brilliantly organised, and thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Yes. Just for everyone else to hear, especially the rest of our tech guys who weren't here, Keith was very impressed. He's done a lot of similar talks and was really impressed with our tech setup. So I will take credit that's not mine as I'm sat here. Can I just move on then to telling everyone about our Zoom pub? So if you want to carry on the chat, we're opening our pub. It's the Lock-ins Razor. You can join with us with or without your video and your audio if you'd rather just observe till you feel a bit more comfortable. Also, we'll be having breakout rooms, and you can drop into and out of breakout rooms with no need to announce yourself at all. So it's very however you want it to be. So just now to everyone, please, one last round of thanks for Keith for his
thank you to the mods.
Thank you so much to the modding. I haven't been looking at the chat during the conversation, but we rely so much on our mods to make sure that everyone in the chat stays decent, honest, helpful, and friendly. So it's a wonderful job. Thank you very much, everyone in the modding group. So moving on then to that last round of thanks, please, for Keith for his excellent talk until we meet next week for Supernatural Happenings or in the pub later. So thank you very much indeed.